Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion between myself, Michael Swaine, and Orville Schell. I am the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I've only been there for about a little less than a year now, and before that I was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and before that I was at the RAND Corporation, and I am a specialist focusing in particular on China-related security issues, but I look at a range of other aspects of China, U.S.-China relations that relate to U.S. and regional interests. And Orville, why don't you introduce yourself?
So I'm Orville Schell, currently the director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society, formerly a professor and dean at UC Berkeley, and a long-time follower of things Chinese, inhabited both the academic side of the ledger and the journalistic side for many decades, and written in a wide manner about the whole sort of U.S.-China proposition. So with that as starters, let me start off, Michael, and ask you a question. It seems to me that one of the most critical questions that we confront now as we contemplate the U.S.-China divide is this. Is it still possible for the United States in its policy formation to expect to influence China? And if so, how?
Well, that's starting off with a nice, small, easily to digest question. Is it still possible to influence China? Yes, I certainly think it is. And I say that because I think that China does not have the kind of independent, autonomous control, power, if you will, soft power, hard power, to be able to ignore the views and the policies and the leverage and influence that the United States still exerts in the world, and which it can exert on China in particular. China is deeply integrated into the world now. It's integrated in the global economic system. It cares what other countries think about it. And so it, I think, very much is receptive to pressure and other sorts of actions, both positive and negative. I shouldn't just say pressure, but positive incentives as well. As to what the United States can do, I think that gets us into a whole range of policy recommendations and issues that the United States could adopt that would influence China. Depends on what area we're talking about. I think it can influence China first and foremost by not presenting China as the kind of 100-foot tall, about to take over the world, overturn the global order, militarily be belligerent against countries across the world, et cetera, that you hear on a fairly routine basis now from people in Washington, which just deepens the Chinese commitment and belief that the United States is indeed hostile, deeply hostile to China, and trying to undermine the country. Not just the CCP, but undermine China. Mm-hmm. So I think the U.S. can have a real influence by not demonizing China the degree to it which it does. And of course, the same holds for the Chinese as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's just one area. But I mean, I don't want to go on for too long here, but there are a lot of different areas where I think the United States could very well initiate different types of actions that could have a potential influence on the Chinese. I mean, we can go down them now if you want to, but...
Well, before we get to those, let me just ask one follow-up question. I mean, I could spend my whole hour here just asking you questions. So it seems to me that we have come to a kind of an inflection point in the relationship where the whole supposition of engagement, which really sort of animated the relationship and gave the relationship some sort of sense of a compass point to steer to, has come to an end. How do you analyze the crashing and burning of engagement? Who do you view as largely responsible for us having to vacate that whole framework?
Well, I guess I would, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily frame the issue or the problem the way you just framed it, Orville. I think we should try to get away from using the word engagement as if it means interacting with the Chinese, which is what the word generally means. We should understand that engagement includes all kinds of different types of interactions, some of which are positive and productive, some of which are not. We have no choice but to continue engaging with China. So U.S. policy is unavoidably one of engagement. The question is, what kind of engagement? Now, what you're asking, I think, is what led to the evolution of what we see now, which is the movement towards a more adversarial, more kind of contentious and zero-sum relationship between the United States and China.
Yes, precisely.
And there, I think there are many different reasons for it, and they lie on all sides. I think part of the reason is because China itself has become domestically more controlling, the Chinese government, more controlling, more repressive, more ideologically rigid. It has done so in part in response to what it sees as the threats and dangers that are posed both by development and the kind of vociferous and centrifugal forces that development produces in Chinese society, which makes it less stable, and as a result of the actions of other countries, which the Chinese have interpreted as seeking to take advantage of, if you will, Chinese weaknesses. So the Chinese themselves, I think, have adopted a stance that is more defensive and that is more critical and controlling. It's a kind of a throwback of sorts to the Leninist approach to controlling Chinese society, which I think is a failing model for China, but Xi Jinping apparently is trying to pursue it alongside a global position as well, which I think are ultimately to prove incompatible. But I think that is one area. So you can see on both sides there, China has some fault here by how it's interpreted what it's been seen as happening. But the United States also, I think, bears some blame here. Because the United States, I think, if it was naive to assume that China, through economic reform, was going to be transformed into some kind of proto-liberal democratic state or very flexible, tolerant, open society along Western lines, which I think was never really in the offing. The question was always what would be the balance within China between flexibility and openness and desire for control and avoiding chaos. And I think the United States, because it saw China moving in a less cooperative direction, I think it reacted and overreacted to what it saw. And we're still in that process of overreaction on the part of the United States. So it's a mutually contributing kind of a vicious circle, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, I could follow up, but maybe I should remand the questioning over to you for a moment.
Well, I'm fine. It's fine in whatever direction. But I guess my main question for you, Orville, would be, as you look at China today, and you put it in the context of American interests, China's own interests, and the interests of the world, let's say, what do you see as China's position? Where does China pose a threat, if it does, and how? And where might it not pose a threat? And where are there opportunities? And do you think that U.S. policy is adequately, engaging on both sides of that issue?
Well, I think let's bookmark the question of threat, and I'd like to come back to that. I think the thing for me, which is rather, I don't think I have a completely comprehensible answer to, is why is it in China's interest? Why is it in Xi Jinping's national interest, China's national interest, for them to have antagonized, and I think that's a word that is not too excessive, so many countries abroad who were quite content to whatever we call engagement. And I look at engagement not so much as a presumption that China is going to turn into a liberal democratic society, but simply that it is in progress, reforming towards some very uncertain, distant horizon that is more congenial, more absorbable, and more convergent with the world outside, whether it's in the market system, the system of global governance, or whatnot. So I wonder, what it was that precipitated what I consider to be a very tectonic change, namely an increasing adversarial relationship. And in this, perhaps I disagree with you a little. I see the preponderance of responsibility on the Chinese side. Because in my experience, the United States really has bent over backwards for decades to make engagement work. I mean, whether it's Scowcroft going to Deng Xiaoping in 1989 after the Beijing massacre and almost begging Deng Xiaoping to keep the relationship alive, or whether it's Clinton who came in talking about butchers from Baghdad to Beijing, but ended up facilitating China entering the World Trade Organization. And one could go on. I don't really fully comprehend how it is in China's interest to have vacated that framework, and also in the process alienated countries as wide from Norway to Sweden to Canada, Australia, India, even Japan, I would have to say, never mind Taiwan, Hong Kong, and whatever happens to Germany and Britain. That to me is something of an enigma. And I don't fully see it as something that the United States either caused or can repair. And I'm curious maybe to throw back at you before we get to the question of the China threat. Why do you think this happened? And why wasn't it in China's interest just to play along, keep their head down and bide their time for another decade or two and continue their economic development and their very impressive integration into the world system?
Well, we can argue about the degree to which China has in fact turned its back or changed fundamentally in its position towards the international system, how many countries are alienated by Chinese behavior. The countries that are usually referred to are Western European and American democratic countries. But
don't forget Vietnam, the Philippines, the worm is turning.
Countries that are right on China's periphery are much more concerned, of course, by nature, to be much more suspicious towards China. But more broadly, globally, you don't see the same shift, the same very clear shift against China that you see in the West and in parts of Asia. So it's not a global phenomenon. It's a mixed phenomenon of sorts. I think it emerged. I think China's shift towards a greater dependence upon ideology, a greater dependence upon party control, a greater emphasis on its sovereign rights, as it's called, protecting its rights and interests, I think came about for several reasons. I think one of them was the general perception that the Chinese had about how the political order in the world was changing in ways that threatened what the Chinese saw as their foundation for order and development in the country, which of course is the party and the party's role in China. And it saw this in terms of obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union, of Russia once it had collapsed, the colored revolutions that occurred in various parts of the world, in the developing world, the rise of the unipolar American moment, America's own actions in invading Iraq without any international legal imprimatur, other actions that the United States had taken in different parts of the world that China saw as either directly or indirectly threatening. And added to that, I think, was the issue of how China viewed sovereignty and its sovereignty claims. All of these claims, Taiwan, the South China Sea, East China Sea, they're not new. They've been around forever, for a long time. And the Chinese concluded for various reasons that as a part of the changes that were going on, particularly the greater level of potential animosity between the U.S. and China, these issues were becoming drawn more and more into the larger strategic question, and the Chinese were getting greater capabilities to deal with these issues, so they tended to incline more towards assertions on these sovereignty issues, particularly in response to what they saw as efforts to change the rules of the game or to change the understandings. That was the case with the Senkaku Gyayutai. That was the case with the assertion by Philippines and Malaysia and others back in 2009 when they submitted their note verbal to the UNCLOS Commission on what their claims were in the South China Sea. So whether you accept it or not, the Chinese saw the situation as shifting in ways that in some ways really compromise their ability to maintain order and control and development within China. That's how I would explain it.
I mean, certainly one could say that there was a much more expansive view of what China saw as within its purview of its need to control sort of area. I mean, the South China Sea, yes, there was always some sort of low grade recognition that there was a 9-dash line out there, but it wasn't really till Hu Jintao that the question of core interest in the South China Sea came up. And things were going quite nicely in Hong Kong until, well, we all know the litany of things that happened there. So it seems to me that there was a much greater expansion of Chinese pretension of control around the region, which is really what inflamed not only the South China Sea, but the Indian border, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the Senkakus, and has sort of cast a spell that's changed the sort of the chemistry that was in a state of I think, steady state under the old, if we may call it, the engagement regime. But I'd like to ask a question with that sort of, at least that's my view. Do you think that at this point we either should, and is there any way to do this, to just simply say the Chinese Communist Party is a one-party Leninist state with a value system with which we completely disagree, but we just should overlook it. We should accept it. We should stop criticizing it. We should stop sort of, antagonizing China with all of our sanctimonious systems, competitions, and judgments, and just get along a little bit the way, I mean, you remember Kissinger, what he was most proud of having accomplished was setting ideology aside in 1972 and removing the ideological question from the bigger geopolitical game, and of course recasting the whole world order. Do you think we should do that, and do you think it is possible to do that? And if we manage to do that, would it have a salutary effect?
I wouldn't say that the United States should do that. I don't think the United States should go as far as you're suggesting, Orville. That is to say, just simply saying we don't have any role to play in commenting on what goes on inside China, basically accepting what the Chinese say, and that we're just going to focus on great power dynamics or whatever political, et cetera, issues we need to deal with. I think that the United States will always remain concerned about and in efforts to try to gain greater recognition and acceptance and support both in its own country and overseas for its values, its ideals. And I think that remains an important thing. But that issue needs to be, I think, very clearly defined. It has to be clearly conceived in policy terms. It has to be clearly laid out what the objectives are by doing so, what likely you're going to achieve those objectives, and if not, what are you going to do then? And too often the United States kind of backs into this issue, like Lincoln did in front of the Congress, and just declared, yes, you're right, Congressman, China is committing genocide. The State Department didn't conduct a thorough examination of whether or not China was committing genocide. It didn't look at the International Court of Justice to see if there was a judgment made in that regard. It just said it was genocide. And it referred to some reports that it picked up. And not even thinking about what the possible implications or complications of that could be. So I think you have to be very clear about what it is you're after when you make these statements. In some cases, it's a necessary statement that reasserts America's own commitment to these values. But it has to be done consistently. And it has to be done, applied not just to this or that country, but it has to be applied as much as possible across the board. The Biden administration right now is ballyhooing this idea of democracy versus authoritarianism, which I really think is an awful, awful way to look at the globe, the world today, and the dynamic between ourselves and the Chinese.
So how would you look at it? I mean, recognizing that there is a difference, recognizing that China certainly has very ambitious aspirations to spread its influence, however you interpret that, whether it's economic, trade, financial, ideological, you name it, cultural. What's your sort of fix on this dilemma?
Well, I think that, first of all, you should throw out these simple labels. I think if you want to describe this relationship, I would describe it as an effort to establish constructive competition and shared leadership in a multipolar world, not a bipolar world.
Does that include competition with political systems and political values? I mean, could we make that explicit? Say we compete in trade. Let's compete also in systems and values.
Sure. As long as you're not saying what this means is for the United States to preserve its most vital interests, it must change China. It must make China into a democratic or open society. The idea of regime change as an objective for the United States, I think, is a non-starter. It's led us down into so many rabbit holes in various parts of the world. And with the Chinese, it ain't going to work.
Okay, so let's stop here for a minute, Michael, and let me needle you a little. If we were to broach this topic, which I think you rightfully raised as a kind of key irritant, the notion of regime change, or as the Chinese say, peaceful evolution, how would we phrase this? When Biden gives a speech to Xi, he wants to transform the relationship, change things. What will he say about regime change? We, the United States of America, henceforth, what?
Well, he would say, we, the United States of America, believe that all countries should have the right to choose their own leaders, that they should be able to exist in environments of safety and security, that they should be able to develop to the height of their potential, and that other countries should not try to undermine and interfere with that process. Now, if these countries are engaged in clear international violations of global norms that are upheld by the international community, then under those conditions, I think the United States and other countries have a responsibility to act. I wouldn't say that is the case with the Chinese. I wouldn't say you have that coalition. I wouldn't say you have anything like that kind of coalition to act in the case of China. And you also have to be able to come into mind, what is exactly the value you're trying to uphold here? How widely is it recognized as an international norm? What does it consist of? And what is the best way to try and get a country to change it? And that may not be regime change, that's for sure.
Well, then what is our response in the South China Sea? What is our response in Hong Kong when China does not live up to the understanding with the British and when during the handover? And what should our response be under your framework, where we say we're not going to interfere in your internal affairs, your system is your system, but when you start reaching tentacles out around you, then maybe the game changes. So what should our attitude towards Taiwan be?
I mean, Orville, you throw so many different images into that statement that just go off in so many different directions.
No. I'm asking a very simple question.
Tentacles out to influence this, that, and the other, right? Okay. In the case of Hong Kong, what is Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong was a colony.
Now, what is it today?
it's an autonomous region.
No. What is it today?
It is sovereign Chinese territory. Yes, to be sure. It
is a part of sovereign Chinese territory, correct?
Yes, but with an agreement that was signed with the British.
Which never compromised the ultimate sovereignty of China over Hong Kong. No. Ultimate sovereign authority over Hong Kong resided in the National People's Congress.
Yes, I accept that.
Full stop. Never changed.
Yeah. So does that...
So then you're getting into questions of, is China upholding, put aside the entire issue of, is China suppressing the ability of Hong Kong to become an independent country? You bet it is. And you're not going to get it to change.
Yeah.
And there's no basis for you making an argument that it should change. So you're making the argument basically that China has in some way abused the understanding that it met or arrived at in the basic law and the agreement with Great Britain over the future of Hong Kong. Now you have to get into the question, okay, if it's done that, why did that happen? And I do not believe that this simply happened because the Chinese woke up one day and said, gee, Hong Kong is a little bit too autonomous for our liking. I think we're going to take it over and screw what we've done with the British and anybody else. If you take that view, then it's ahistorical, because where we ended up in Hong Kong was a very sad dynamic between the British government, the people on Hong Kong, including the democracy movement, and the United States. And I think we've ended up in a very sorry situation where there is lots of blame around on all sides.
Well, let's just parse through that a bit. One country, two systems does presuppose certain divisions, even though Hong Kong has become sovereign territory of China. And in what manner do you think that the responsibility for what has been happening over the last year or two lies in the hands of, let's say, the British, the Americans, or the Hong Kong people?
No, I think the responsibility, if you want to talk about responsibility, you have to go back to at least 2014. You have to go back to the emergence of the umbrella movement, and you have to go back to what precipitated that movement and what the possible compromises were between Beijing and the Hong Kong government and the people in Hong Kong at that time. My view is that the Hong Kong government tried to establish a middle ground with the tacit understanding of Beijing, and the democratic movement in Hong Kong would not accept it. They would not accept a middle ground for Hong Kong that limited the extension of democracy within the system. There was some liberalization, and the Chinese were prepared to go even further. The Democrats said, not enough. We want one man, one vote, direct election, nominations. We're going to select our own people. Thank you very much.
So we are back to
none of that was in the joint declaration. None of that was in the basic law. So they pushed this situation in a very bad way. Now, the Chinese, for their part, of course, overreacted to it. And they concluded that the best way to deal with this is to strengthen the position of the tycoons in Hong Kong, to strengthen the position of the oligarch in Hong Kong, which they used to maintain control. It wasn't to really try to proceed beyond the umbrella movement and the protest of democracy to try to get some kind of middle ground here that would alleviate both the economic and the political complaints of the Hong Kong people. They didn't do that. They took a much more simplistic and much more hardline role, and then the ball started to roll, and each side then upped the ante. That's where we are.
So in the end, in effect, I mean, what we're sort of concluding here is that really it does boil down, in a sense, to a different political view of political systems and values, because there were two very different notions of what the democratization of Hong Kong would look like. Different in Hong Kong and different what the Chinese Communist Party could tolerate and accept. So how do we escape that?
Well, I think that's true. Well, you can't, if that exists in a cosmopolitan place like Hong Kong, Orville, which is not like Tianjin or some deep domestic mainland Chinese city, when you've got that level of exposure to the outside world, you've got that level of cosmopolitanism, obviously you've got people within Hong Kong who want something that is going to be closer to approximating the West. And they're not going to be as inclined towards China, particularly if China seems to be too controlling in its relationship. So you have an inherent problem, inherent contradiction there. Mm-hmm. That is not a contradiction that you can solve from the outside. You can't basically alter fundamentally the attitude of the Hong Kong population themselves to the extent that they do support the idea of moving more towards the West, or the Chinese government themselves, mm-hmm. given their views about Hong Kong, what Hong Kong stood for symbolically, and their incredibly sensitive attitude towards foreign intervention in Hong Kong.
But do you see what happened in Hong Kong? I mean, from my perspective, yes, there were comments made, there was support given verbally, but this was largely, it seems to me, a rather indigenous movement in Hong Kong that wasn't stirred up by, the CIA or foreign intervention or a coup.
No, I don't. I think it's ridiculous for the Chinese to maintain, to even suggest that the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement was created by and sustained by the United States. I mean, that is absurd. It didn't have to be created and sustained by the United States. It already had a considerable amount of momentum on its own that resided in the upbringing, the feelings, the attitudes of particularly young Hong Kong citizens, alongside with, I think, the very strong complaints that many Hong Kong citizens had about their economic conditions under the one country, two systems arrangement, which did not serve their interests. We should keep in mind that the criticisms in Hong Kong were not just about politics. A lot of them had to do with the unjust, unequal economic distribution of wealth within Hong Kong, particularly the control of the Hong Kong tycoons. And Beijing really made a mistake in backing them, in suppressing much of the economic growth for ordinary people in Hong Kong. But again, the question, though, is you can't get around this for sure. I mean, you're not going to solve this problem from the outside by sanctioning Chinese officials who have to do with Hong Kong, which is just, totally will have no positive effect. Just leaves the Chinese to try and sanction some U.S. officials.
So what is the right response?
I think the only right response can be that the United States, with Hong Kong, as it does in other cases, and it should do with other countries and in other instances, stands for the rights of individuals to be heard, the right that they should have their governments reflect their interests. If they don't do that, then the United States has to decide how far is it willing to go in a situation where it will not resolve the problem. How far is it willing to go to compromise its interests in other areas with China and with other countries to achieve these objectives?
So how far do you think the United States should have gone in regard to responses to let's say, Hong Kong? I mean, we're using this kind of metaphor.
Yeah, I know. We're getting into just Hong Kong here.
Yeah,
which
I want to
really kind of unfortunate. But
well, answer that, and then I have another question for you.
Well, I didn't realize this was going to be such an inquisition, Orville. But,
well, you can turn the Inquisition if you like. I don't want to monopolize the.
Okay. Anyway, I think that the United States was very limited in its options in terms of what it could actually do as opposed to what it could say regarding Hong Kong. I think that the idea of giving Hong Kong emigres, if they leave Hong Kong, if they want to leave Hong Kong, sanctuary, if you will, admission into the United States is something that definitely should be considered, and I would think should be done. And that there should be efforts to try to resist and very strongly resist, absolutely oppose any efforts by China to try to expatriate Hong Kong, young Hong Kong pro-democracy, pro-freedom, whatever, individuals who are in the United States. These ideas of extrajudicial extradition and applying their domestic situation to Chinese overseas, I think is despicable on the part of the Chinese, and it has a kind of a greater Chinese diaspora, kind of we stand for all Chinese around the world kind of aspect to it, which I think is extremely corrosive for China's image in the world. So I think the United States should push back against that, provide the opportunities, and whatever things it can possibly do to try to encourage Hong Kong's economic stability and Hong Kong's growth and the fairness of the Hong Kong economy. Damaging the Hong Kong people by leveling certain types of sanctions, I think, is just simply counterproductive. Doesn't serve any good end. And it makes the United States look good. Congressmen can stand up and brag about it, but it doesn't have any positive effect. So I think you have to be selective, and you have to recognize that what you can do is genuinely limited.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to turn the Inquisition over to you, Michael.
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to sort of ask you a specific question beyond what I've said before. I guess I would say, what do you think should be the best policy for the United States in dealing with your version or your vision of what China is today? I doubt very much if you think that the United States should just decouple and contain and sort of try and bring down the regime, that we should bring all American businessmen out of China, that we should, do all the things that the Trump administration seemed to be wanting to do. So where would you strike the balance? Where exactly would you say, yeah, we need to stand firm here, but we also need to reach certain types of understandings with the Chinese in these areas. And if that involves some amount of mutual compromise or accommodation, then that's necessary. I mean, what is your view on that?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I should preface my answer to your question by saying I do truly lament the loss of the framework of whatever it meant engagement, because it was, we actually had a reasonably workable framework that survived some pretty big shocks. And I think, as I said a moment ago, I think you and I may disagree a little on the degree to which I tend to put the responsibility for that end in the hands of, I think, more in the hands of Xi Jinping than in the hands of the United States policy. Even Trump, who was a kind of a train wreck of his own kind. I think that, what we need to really perfect is this combination. I think Biden is to some degree really trying to do this, pushback and embrace at the same time, and to stand up and resist and push back against China in ways that I think it really is acting in an increasingly aggressive, offensive, and disruptive way. But always remember that diplomacy is far better than war, and giving a little to get a little is really the better solution than just obdurate resistance. And to those ways where there is common interest, and I think certainly in trade, there's some common interest in climate change and nuclear proliferation. You know the list. What I'm unresolved on, and I wonder what you think, how you would respond to this, is I'm not very confident that China is able to keep the door open and cooperate in some areas while being in a state of adversarial resistance and contention in others. I think the Biden administration actually can, even though the political climate in Washington is pretty toxic at this time. But that would be my prescription. I do think we are in something of a clash of values and political systems, and I do think China's influence seeking around the world is worrisome and corrosive and corrupting in certain ways. And we have to be mindful of that, but not react in a kind of an extreme overboard fashion that also corrupts the openness of our own society. It's a real high wire act right now, but something is definitely going on, Michael, which is more than just trade. China isn't just another trading partner. I think they have weaponized trade, and I consider them power traders, not free traders. They have hooked up the trade regimen and the Belt and Road, all of their efforts to globalize their system, I think in ways that are subtle, but profound, to a very different way of being in the world. It centers around a deeply rooted one-party system, Leninist system, that doesn't esteem the same values that the liberal democratic world in all its fallen state of majesty and chaos does subscribe to. So that's, it doesn't give you a lot of detail, but simply to say that I think we're in a new world where there is a lot of adversity, a lot of contradiction, and we do have to stand up and resist. But at the same time, if we're going to lead, we have to lead. And we have to take initiatives and try to find ways that we can change the game with China. Because the game we're playing now, it seems to me, is a deadly spiral downward into perdition.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think both sides are contributing to a worsening what you call security dilemma, in which the worst case motives and intentions of the other are assumed increasingly by each side. Suspicion is so deep and trust is so rare that each side is just desiring that the most important thing they need to do is amass greater leverage, mainly in negative terms, to coerce or influence the other side. And that's a recipe for disaster, because you cannot, this competition that the United States is in with China is not winnable in any absolute sense. You're not going to win this competition, as Biden likes to say. We're in it for the long term, we're going to win it. In the global environment in which we exist today, there is no winning. You've got to be able to continue to compete indefinitely in ways that can both encourage, that can both deepen your ability to exert different types of pressure or counter incentives on the Chinese where it's needed most, while at the same time maintaining levels of cooperation and engagement that allow you to address the most critical issues that you all face. And I
guess China do that, Michael?
I think China can do that, because I think the most critical issues that we face, and this gets down to the question really about what is the threat. See, I agree with you, Orville, that I think the United States needs to be very clear about pushing back on areas where China is clearly doing things that are threatening other countries' interests or the United States' own interests in various ways. But the key question is always, what are those threats? How are they manifested? How serious are they? And what are they amenable to influence? How are they amenable to influence? And there, I think the United States is thus far pathetic in assessing what is the nature of that threat. The Biden administration, I can tell you, beyond their mantra about rules-based order, seeking close relations with allies and friends, dealing from a position of strength, these mantras that they come out with have very little behind them thus far. There's no clear China strategy about attaining specific objectives in specific policy areas using specific means. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to get down to that. You have to get away from the idea that what we're dealing with is this big, bad, zero-sum threat, 10 feet tall, out to get us. You've got to be able to understand that that is not what we're dealing with. China is not an existential threat to the United States. China does not pose the threat of overturning the American political system or destroying American territory or vital American interests. It is impacting against a variety of different issues that challenge the United States, particularly challenging American assumptions. America tends to assume that the world best gets around and is stable and develops because of American dominance, because America is the prevailing leader in the world. Well, that's changing. And it's changing, I think, in a significant way, and it's unlikely to come back in the way in which it did exist for 70 years after the Second World War. The U.S. hasn't sufficiently understood what that means and how China fits into that new changing framework. I think the United States has as much, if not more, work to do than the Chinese in adjusting to this changing environment in the world.
I agree with you that I think that is true, that space does need to be made for a rising power like China, and the United States doesn't really quite feel comfortable with that new adjustment. But I think what turns this into a highly inflammatory situation is that this is not just Britain and the United States. or even Japan in the 90s in the United States, where we had similar political systems, we had alliances in one thing or another. This is fraught with a whole other sort of ideological and political dimension. So it isn't as if just one power is replacing another. It's two different systems. One is challenging the other. So you asked earlier on about the China threat. Let's just dwell on that for a minute, and let me ask you: how do you see the China threat? How would you describe it?
I think the primary threat that China poses to the United States, if you want to call it, well, the best way to put it is, I think the primary threat involving China is exactly what we just talked about a minute ago, which is a deepening security competition leading to an increased likelihood of crises, particularly in Asia, and conflict. That is the threat. It's
an
not
accident leading to conflict.
It's the dynamic itself. The dynamic itself is the major threat that the United States faces with regard to China. Now, then you have to analyze what is the basis of that dynamic. And if you believe it's all the Chinese and they're doing X, Y, and Z, then you can say, okay, that's a Chinese threat. I don't happen to believe that. I think that both sides contribute to it in certain very significant ways, and we need to get beyond it. But there you have it. If you go beyond that, I think the potential and the threat here is really one of uncertainty, comes from not the Chinese military, but it comes from economic and technological, particularly technological. I think that there is and here the danger is not that China is going to acquire the dominant world technologies and by virtue of that dominance take over the world. The real danger is that the United States and China are going to move into a bifurcated system of technologies that are competitive with each other, that work to the mutual detriment of both countries. They impoverish both countries.
That's a very interesting thought, and I actually think that you're right. And you describe it as a danger. I would describe it as more than a danger, as an incipient tendency that's beginning to manifest itself in a deeper and deeper way, particularly, let's say, around the question of microprocessors. We are going to end up with perhaps starting in certain fields of technology and ultimately possibly even in the renminbi and the dollar being different exchange currencies in different economic realms that have different technological streams feeding into them.
I agree with you. So I think we have to work to try to avert this. I don't think we should just sit back
and do that.
My God, it's inevitable. Well, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to be able to have a reasonable, fact-based assessment about exactly what the dangers are to on a technology front for the United States. And by dangers, you have to think of that in two senses. Not just the danger of China acquiring certain technologies and therefore using them against us, but also the danger of our not being able to engage with the Chinese scientists and others to try to deal with certain major problems around the world. Climate change would be a big one. Technology plays a massive role there. That we can't address these problems effectively because, oh my God, it's the Chinese and it has to do with technology. I mean, that is also a big danger, and we're not dealing with that nearly well enough. Because the impulse, Orville, the reflexive impulse in Washington, and if you were here, I mean, it's always to take every issue, push it through the security lens, and say, oh my God, the Chinese are going to get us. I mean, there are guys talking about the use of thermostats, for Christ's sakes, by the Chinese to try to control voting in the United States. It's gotten to be that
Michael,
crazy.
You have to acknowledge that there are some real power political realities out there of a Chinese military that's been on the rise.
Oh, of course, I'm not the least bit wanting to see. This is the thing. I don't jump from sort of saying that we need to be able to get our hands around this issue and strike some kind of clarity on it and middle ground in regarding it, and then say, well, that I'm ignoring all the things the Chinese do bad. I'm not. The Chinese have done one area where I really hit the Chinese, and I do every time, is to do with the cyber issue. Mm-hmm. I think the Chinese, from what I can understand, and this is all very classified in many areas, but from what I can understand, talking to people who are in that world, is that the Chinese are increasingly aggressive players, and that their action is very much different from what they say about it. It's probably the one area where the Chinese, what they say in their propaganda and what they're actually doing is so different. And that, I think, deserves some serious attention and the possibility that the United States should in itself retaliate for certain types of actions that China may take. But of course, with the understanding, again, as in many of these areas, that the United States itself is engaged in this kind of activity.
Yeah.
And the United States itself is also doing this. So, there's always only so far you can go in doing this until you come up against the fact that the Chinese, in some cases are themselves the victim of some of the actions that are being taken.
Yes. So let me, how do you look at the South China Sea, which seems to me to be a particularly sort of inflammatory area of Chinese expansion and a particularly dangerous one? What's your view on what we should do about the South China Sea?
Well, we've written an entire East Asia strategy report that includes a whole section on this at the Quincy Institute, and my former colleague, who has just recently left Quincy and gone to the State Department, Rachel Odell, has just written a really interesting paper on this, on the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So I encourage you and the viewers to read that paper, because I tend to agree with most, if not all, of what was in it. And I think that the South China Sea is a great example of the need for the United States and China to be able to reach some kind of meaningful understanding about limiting militarization in that region. And in doing that, a lot of things have to be on the table, including U.S. freedom of navigation operations. I think that the United States can uphold its own view of maritime law, and it is a view that is upheld by a lot of other countries, although by no means all, and not just opposed by the Chinese. I think it needs to have a meaningful discussion here about the limits on how far you're going to go in trying to militarize the region, because in peacetime, nobody's going to try to exclude anybody from the South China Sea. The Chinese certainly are not going to do that commercially. They've never given the slightest indication that they would want to do that. They're the primary dependent on the South China Sea traffic. So it's really about the kinds of dangers that could occur if you had conflict and what that would mean. And I think that there you need to reduce the chances of you having conflict by the Chinese, first of all, stating alongside the other members or the other disputants that they will never use force first against another claimant on their territory unless they were previously attacked in some way. In other words, the Chinese and the others would not use military capabilities to try to alter the status quo on the ground in the South China Sea regarding the possession and location of the different countries that are occupying the different areas. People say, oh, well, they've already done that. It was in the declaration back in 2002. It was very vague. It was 2 decades ago, and it needs reaffirming very clearly, I think.
Do you accept Chinese claims in the South China Sea?
Oh no, I don't accept I don't accept them. I don't reject them, and neither, by the way, does the United States. In terms of territory, I think that their claims to the maritime control, I think, are unclear, and because they're unclear, they tend to be worst case, and on that basis, they seem pretty ridiculous. The Chinese can't claim to have historical rights to fishing all throughout the 9-dash line into the exclusive economic zones of other countries in the region, just because they say the 9-dash line is there and because they have some kind of vague historical rights. The UNCLOS has already rejected the idea that these historic rights are based on anything. And I think that that's a perfectly satisfactory basis for action here. I think the real danger here is not whether the Chinese are going to start running roughshod and just redefining the whole region. I think the danger is that you will get this incremental nudging and testing of all the different sides with looking towards the United States and what it's going to do to back or to support or oppose what country does or doesn't do. And you want to try and get out of that kind of dynamic by having more movement on the code of conduct, of course, and I think the U.S. should do much more in encouraging that.
Well, that's been going on for 20 years.
I know. Well, it needs to move. They've got a framework. They've put together a framework. They've just reached a certain understanding about what one element of that framework. Now they have to move forward to try to do something further beyond that. But it's not going to be an easy problem. But I think it can be done if you really do have the kind of international support for doing this and for demilitarizing the area.
It seems to me, Michael, that the real critical question here is, for centuries, powers have managed to navigate international waters in a more or less workable way. It seems to me that the real challenge here is that China is claiming a kind of a sovereignty and a territorial jurisdiction that is sort of almost absurd in its grandiosity. And nobody else quite knows what to do about it. And you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? How is it in any conceivable construal within their national interest to do what they've done? How do you explain that impulse? Where does it come from, and why are they doing it?
When you say to do what they have done, I think that
militarize the whole South China Sea, harass Japanese ships in the East China Sea, overflights to Taiwan, all of this very provocative, very...
Orville, this leads us into a whole discussion about what the dynamic was that led to these kinds of actions.
Yes,
now, you can believe that the Chinese had an objective to try to take over the area because they want it to be a no-go zone and it's going to be their sphere of influence. And it's a prelude to them kicking the U.S. out of Asia, which a very senior U.S. official told me years ago was obviously their purpose.
And what do you think?
I think that the Chinese are highly contingent in how they look at their situation in Asia. And by that, I mean that do they want to increase their capability to deter the United States and to weaken the ability of the United States to, if it wanted to, apply military force against China and its interests, whether it be South China Sea, Taiwan? Of course they do. Of course they do. They're a great power. They don't want the United States to roam freely along their borders up to their 12-mile limit, as the United States has done in the past. What the Chinese have done in that regard is totally understandable to me. The question is, do they want to establish a sphere of influence in the region in which they are dominant? And they will basically call all the shots. There, I think, as I say, I think it is much more contingent than it is sure. We do not know is the clear answer if they want to do that or not. Because what I usually say is, can you make an argument to me that the Chinese believe that it is essential, not just an option, not just preferable if they could get it, but they believe it's essential for them to dominate the region to preserve their most vital interests? And if the answer is yes, give me the evidence. There isn't any. All the evidence that you have can be read in different directions at this point in time. We're not there yet. We are not at that point yet. So my argument is we don't want to assume that we know what the Chinese are doing. And this bothers me about what a lot of people write when they write about like sort of Xi Jinping thinks, blah, blah, blah. He has no idea what Xi Jinping thinks. You can impute certain things based on readings, but you cannot say with some kind of certainty that the Chinese are thinking this or that. So you've got to be able to be flexible in how you deal with this. And you don't want to assume it's going to be zero sum because that closes off all kinds of options. And that's where we're moving. Everything becomes zero sum now with the Chinese.
Let's talk for a minute about decoupling in the waning minutes here. It seems to me that decoupling has moved from a kind of an American conceit that in a certain sense, China is beating the United States to it and beginning to also decouple itself as well in anticipation of what you have described a little earlier as two separate economic and technological realms where we'd have everybody it would be a divided universe. do you think that we should be, let me put it this way, what areas do you think we should decouple from China?
I think we should decouple from China in areas where it is very clear that Chinese acquisition of certain types of capabilities would give them some kind of leverage, militarily in particular, that would have relevance to a specific American interest. Most likely the one would be Taiwan. If they had certain types of technologies that they could attain that they would not otherwise have or have easily, that could make a really big difference in their calculation about the risks and costs of using force in Taiwan, I don't think we should be giving it to them. We don't have to be making those. So you have to define a certain set of technologies that would relate to that. Now, it gets much trickier when you start talking about decoupling from other areas of technology where it's not so clear, the so-called dual use technology. But of course, in some ways, we're going even beyond that. We're going to almost any kind of technology. I mean, for Christ's sakes, subway cars are becoming a technology now that is seen as a national security threat to the United States. I mean, how absurd can you get? But you've got to be able to make that kind of a judgment. And I am certainly not qualified to say exactly where, but I generally, through my interactions with people who know much more than I do about this, am generally supportive of the idea that you want a small area with high walls, as it's called. You want to limit that area as much as you can, but you want to have it so that it's pretty darn impenetrable, which I don't think they're doing well enough. But you want to be able to preserve technology interactions with Chinese scientists in a whole range of areas. I mean, look what's going on right now. The ability of the NIH to interact with Chinese virologists is being destroyed because of the idea, the lunacy idea that Fauci was engaged in gain of function, supporting funding for gain of function for bioweapons in the Wuhan lab.
There, in all fairness, there are other reasons that people might have a
sure, but I'm saying, but that kind of mindset leads you in that kind of a direction, so that you end up with these kinds of, again, zero sum, very maximalist, extreme things. In the trade area, I would say that there is not a whole lot of areas in terms of investment and trade, if you get beyond the sort of national security areas, where you would want to have decoupling. I mean, real break off of any interaction. I can't see a whole lot of different areas that really justify that extreme a level of action. I think you need to have strong U.S. laws and oversight to look at how these companies are managed, to look at what exactly they're doing as best you can. But I think that in many cases, you are doing more harm than good by having this large blanket sort of prohibition on economic relations between the U.S. and China. I mean, that relates to the whole question of the benefits of U.S. and China economic relations. And I'm somebody who believes that on balance, the benefits have been way greater than the deficits for the United States.
I think that's undeniably true. And again, I think that is the beneficial result of the whole conceit of engagement. However, if you believe, as some people do, that there's a reasonable chance of war with China, a military clash, and that something might just start unraveling into war, then it seems to me it casts the whole notion of decoupling into a very different framework, where you suddenly get a much wider justification.
Well, yeah, but we're not in war.
No, we're not in war.
You can't assume that you should behave because if we just might go to war with the Chinese, they're having this connection with us through a supply chain would put us at a disadvantage. I mean, I think that is that's a typical kind of worst case, hair on fire. Oh my God, the Chinese could threaten us in all these different ways if we went to war with them. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. Kind of attitude, which I just don't accept.
Well, now you worked at RAND, and you know the way the Pentagon works. I mean, they're into preparedness, right? They're into analyzing myriad scenarios that
and that's fine. They can do that, but they don't determine U.S. policy. They're not going to set what the priorities are for the United States. They shouldn't be. They have to be prudent, often worst case oriented assessors of what are the dangers and how do we deal with them. And they have to approach that from a particular perspective, right? And if they do it from the perspective of American dominance, we're going to be in trouble.
Well, all true, except if you do believe, as I gather, many American military members who I have the highest regard for do, that there's a real possibility that an accident could lead to a clash, could lead to something bigger, and that we could be off to the races. Then it seems to me you do have to cast a glance at decoupling in a very different way than you might if you were just looking at the moment. You have to look.
Well, that would mean what you're suggesting, I think, is we have to be able to be postured in such a way that if we would need to, we would in fact decouple if the balloon went up. Well, in certain areas, I think that's clearly the case. What would be good in peacetime might not be good in wartime, and I think that's a common issue that any country faces.
But
you have to be able to assess how likely it is that you're going to go to war. What is the nature of that war? What kind of threats would it pose? The most likely, by far, as you well know, threat is Taiwan.
Yeah,
issue of conflict over Taiwan. So you have to focus there on what would that conflict look like? How would you prosecute it? And how could you possibly end up in a successful situation? And does that require decoupling?
Yeah.
I mean, my own view is I don't think it would, but.
I mean, many admirals are also very fearful of some sort of inadvertent clash or some maritime, accident, or an EP3, something in the air. I mean, all of these things could. We all know how World War I started.
You may not know, Orville, but over 15 years now, I've been involved with American colleagues and with the Chinese in a crisis management project, and we've explored a wide range of the kinds of contingencies that you just mentioned.
And is that still functioning?
Almost every crisis you can conceive of between the U.S. and China, political military. Mm-hmm. We've thought of, we've discussed it, and explored it in considerable detail.
Is that an active group now? I mean,
yes, we still interact with the Chinese think tank that does this. Thank goodness, we still have the ability to be able to. Of course, it's because of COVID. We're doing it over the web, but we still have discussions. But I can tell you that the experience of those interactions over many years tells me that there certainly is a potential for miscalculation, miscommunication, misunderstanding that can lead to escalation in a Sino-American crisis. But in many instances, it depends a lot on the nature of the issue, but in many instances, the desire of the Americans and the Chinese to get out of the crisis ASAP is very high.
Precisely the mechanisms to do that?
Precisely because of the dangers that are there. The mechanisms have to do with accurate, timely, and reliable communication. We have hotlines with the Chinese that don't work very well. We need to improve them. Yeah. We need to improve our ability to understand each other, what we mean by certain statements, certain actions. I mean, you speak Chinese, I speak Chinese. Certain phrases that are said by the Chinese, Americans can interpret in ways that are not intended by the Chinese, and vice versa. And there are very many examples of that. So there needs to be greater awareness and understanding and sensitivity, as well as mechanisms for communicating between the two sides. But I can tell you that they're aware of this, and they have given some indication on both sides that they want to improve this dialogue, but we have yet to really see it.
I would have to say, though, that one of the I think the harmful effects of decoupling is that we've also lost some of the musculature that deals with these kinds of things.
Right.
And hotlines and dispute resolution mechanisms.
Well, fortunately, I think that the U.S. and Chinese militaries, even though they are extremely wary towards one another, both of them have an incentive not to get into a war. And, those guys are on the front line, obviously. And they have an incentive, not all of them, but many of them have an incentive to try to reach some kind of a manageable dialogue with each other that can avert the most likely kinds of crises occurring, Orville. So I think that's a potential, that's a door that's open there that the United States should go through and really push it. I mean,
it takes Two, it takes reciprocity. And it also strikes me that this is one of the things where we're most grievously lacking in the relationship is whatever realm you look at, it is precisely reciprocity. And there is a kind of a hostage-taking mentality often, I think particularly in China, where we're not going to give you this unless you give us that. And that's very worrisome to me. And it's also, I think, part of the tragedy of losing the old framework. And we don't have a new framework set up yet.
Well, I mean, I agree in the sense that, we had several, we've always had several former senior officials involved in this crisis management effort. And we had a discussion at one time about what would be the most likely thing that each side could do that would contribute to trying to control the crisis. Mm-hmm. And without dissent, the answer was you need to have lines of communication between individuals who know each other.
Yes,
they actually have to know each other and have some level of confidence in each other that what the other is telling them resembles the truth. I mean, it is really critical. And of course, right now, we don't have that.
Yeah. Well, that's very worrisome. And I rest my point that with an increasingly sort of bellicose, China and an increasingly resistant America arching its back, we're missing exactly what we need most when we have this sort of heightened climate of where accidents and clashes could turn into something more dangerous.
Well, I totally I agree with that in terms of the danger. I don't agree with how you characterize it, but
yeah. Well, I think this is if I may sum up a little here, because I'm sure we're coming to the end of our.
We're well beyond.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd love to hear what your summation. But I think where perhaps you and I disagree most is in trying to analyze how did we come to this impasse. Who was sort of the main precipitating factor in eroding the old system of engagement or whatever we want to call it. That if I do not interpret the Biden administration wrong, I think the door is still very much open if China could come through with some ideas for how to improve things. I think it's worth a test, but I find China at this point particularly difficult to penetrate in terms of the kinds of discussions that could lead to a game-changing moment. I don't know how you respond to that.
Well, I just simply don't see it as so one-sided as you do, Orville. I mean, I think the United States itself, through its jargon, through its rhetoric, through its talk, through its policies, to the extent there are any, has itself shown that it is not interested that much in what I call constructive dialogue at this point. I think the consequence of the so-called failure of engagement is that we just talk to the Chinese and we never get anywhere. I mean, I had somebody in the Trump administration say to me at one time, I don't understand why you support cooperation, because history shows that every time we've tried to cooperate with the Chinese, they've always lied, stolen, cheated, and betrayed us, which is factually simply ridiculous. But that's the attitude, and so if you have that view, then you're not going to get very far with the Chinese. When you call Xi Jinping a thug, I mean, when you come out and you say that this regime is sort of evil incarnate, when you have people on the Congress saying what they say out of largely ignorance, then you should not be surprised if the Chinese become more belligerent in their response. That's not to exonerate them in any way, Orville, but there is a dynamic going on. They look at what they see coming out of the United States. My argument would be maybe we're no longer in this position because we've lost so much of our leverage, not because of what the Chinese have done at all, but because of the domestic situation in the U.S. and its image in the world, which we have brought on ourselves. The Chinese haven't done it. But we may have lost the opportunity, but the United States, in my view, had the upper hand. It was the more dominant power. It was by far the more secure power. It was the more confident power. It had the leeway, if you will, to make concessions, to make initiatives, at least open the door to take the first step with the Chinese. And in recent years, of course, that hasn't happened because we've got this meme out there that kind of dealing with the Chinese is always a failure, and it's always going to be we're going to be taken advantage of. It never works. The Chinese, regardless, blah, blah, blah. It's the usual stuff. And, it's just going to, that resolves nothing. It'll lead us nowhere.
But I do think, Michael, it's fair to say that through the second Obama administration, there was enormous efforts made to sort of play a part, to embrace China, to incorporate China, to express that we didn't view their rise as inimical to our own interests. Now, the Trump administration was another matter. But I would say that during the Obama administration, China did not reciprocate very, very, very convincingly. It did not open its doors. We didn't have Confucius Institutes in China or Jefferson Institutes in China. We didn't have as many journalists there. In other words, it was a relationship that, in my view, when China could have made some adjustments to respond to American outreach during the Obama years, it did not. And it fell out of balance. It was not reciprocal. It was not balanced, and thus not sustainable. And would you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would. I would say that I would say that it was very much of a mixed bag. I would say that there were cases where you had indications of both. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I'm basing my statement basically on conversations I've had with Obama-era administration officials. It wasn't an unremitting chronicle of failure. There was an effort to try to engage the Chinese in various areas, and they did cooperate. They cooperated in areas to do with counterterrorism. They cooperated in areas to do with WMD proliferation. They cooperated in areas to do with economic control. Look at the 2008 financial crisis. The Chinese played a major and significant and productive role. You can say it was totally selfish. Oh, the Chinese just did it for themselves. Well, it had great benefit for the United States, and so they did it. And they didn't necessarily have to do it the way they did, but they did. And I think there are other cases too. So I don't think that you can just simply make the general statement like, well, we've tried, been there, done that. I think the situation's always changing. And we have to keep in mind another thing too, which I think is really important. China remains a country in transition.
Yes,
it is not locked into the Xi Jinping personality cult regime. As you and I both know, I'm sure, many Chinese intellectuals are not at all happy with what's going on today in China.
Yeah.
They're critical of it. They think it's counterproductive. They think it will move in the wrong direction. They think the idea of America being in an irreversible decline that is held perhaps by some people in the Chinese leadership is not accurate, that it is not productive, and it doesn't help Chinese interests. Yeah. Now, that's an interesting thing. Would you ever hear that in Washington that some Chinese, you'd never hear that. Yeah. You'd always hear that Chinese are all kind of all together. They all know. So you've got a situation in China where Xi Jinping is pursuing a certain line of policies that I think ultimately will prove to be counterproductive for the country. They will give the CCP more control, yes, over a period of time, but they're not going to play to the advantages that the China needs to have to continue to compete in the 21st century, which means open information, innovation, all of that. I mean, we talk about Chinese industrial policies as if they're this gigantic threat to us. Well, state-owned enterprise and all that, when in fact, many economists will tell you that ain't a good way to try to develop any economy. So, we shouldn't be looking at China as if it's locked in concrete and it's 10 feet tall. It is in transition, and we need to keep the door open, particularly among those groups within China who might not agree with the way things are going now.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Michael. I think that it's really important. We've all been around this block enough times to see China reinvent itself numerous times in very different guises. And if you had asked me in 1975 when I was working on the Dazhai People's Commune, if I could imagine what was about to happen several years later when Mao died and Deng Xiaoping came along, I would have thought you were bereft of your senses.
Of course.
And yet it happened. And then we've had several other incarnations of a very different kind of China where some people fall completely silent and go off the screen, and then suddenly they reappear again.
That's right.
It's really important to remember that incipient within the situation now as we see it and experience it, which is without a lot of dissenting voices, there still is a diversity that is latent there, and that ultimately I think you're right. We should never assume that the freeze frame we get of the moment is the eternal situation.
There you go. There's a point we agree on.
Well, we agree on more than you think. I think that's a good point to end on in any event.
Yeah, right. Me too. That's great. Well, thanks, Orville. I really enjoyed this.
Same. Nice to talk.